Okay, hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 68, the channel admin on this one. I know it's been a bit thin on the ground recently, but it's going to be somewhat longer than normal as I'm going to give you a bit more detail on my trip to America, coming up April 2020 to an American continent near you. So, for those of you who may be interested, this is the schedule as currently sits. On Friday, the 3rd of April, I will arrive in the evening in Boston. So if people want to meet up in the evening on that Friday evening, I'm not adverse to it, albeit that obviously I've got to get out of the airport, so I don't know how long that'll take. But sort of 9 o'clock-ish will probably be fine. I'm then spending the next 4 days, so that's the Saturday, Sunday, Monday and Tuesday in Boston or the surrounding area. 2 days, basically 2 days in Boston and 2 days at Fall River, looking at various ships, obviously. Then on Tuesday the 7th, I will be taking the 2040 JetBlue flight to Philadelphia. So Wednesday the 8th and Thursday the 9th, I will be in Philadelphia. So if people want to meet up in Philadelphia, I'd suggest probably the Wednesday evening is the best one for that. I'm then going to head down to Norfolk. And so Norfolk, I will only be there for the day on the Friday the 10th. In the evening, if anyone happens to be in Norfolk, I will be around because I'm then getting the 6 o'clock in the morning flight on the 11th, the 6 o'clock United flight on the 11th to Wilmington, which is where I will spend the rest of Saturday. And then this is going to be a bit of a hellish day because on the 11th, not only am I flying into Wilmington, I've then also got to get back to the airport to fly out on the 8 o'clock in the evening or 2000 American Airlines flight to Charleston, which is where I will be on Sunday. I'll be in Charleston for all of Sunday, and then on the morning of Monday the 13th, I'll be taking the 6 o'clock flight via Delta, and that will take me to Mobile, as I understand it's called, even though it's spelt mobile. So, yes, Monday I will be in Mobile. Monday evening will be obviously available in theory. And then on Tuesday, I'm actually going to take a little break with tradition. I'm not going to take a stupidly early or stupidly late flight. I'm going to take the 11:55 United flight on Tuesday the 14th from Mobile to San Diego. Arriving in San Diego, obviously, in the afternoon of Tuesday the 14th. So, again, that Tuesday evening, those of you in San Diego, probably a decent time to meet up. And then, obviously, I'll be having a look at, I believe it's USS Midway in San Diego, and I'll be there through Wednesday the 15th. And then Thursday the 16th at 19:55 in the evening, I'll be taking the American Airlines flight to Los Angeles. And then I will be spending Friday the 17th in Los Angeles, which will then be finished up by me taking the 1930 Norwegian Airlines non-stop flight all the way back to good old Blighty. So that is that. You can obviously skip back through that if you want to get a few more details. Some of those places, unfortunately, given the time you've got to check in at the airport, I won't be around in the evening. Others I will be. But obviously I'll be there during the day at the various ships. It won't be too difficult to figure out which ones. And I will provide a few more details as we go on. But I'm going to book those flights hopefully by the end of the coming week at the time that this is released. So, there you have my travel itinerary, and we'll see how many people we can find on the way. I highly suspect I will need vast amounts of caffeine for this, but there you go. You only live once. Unless you don't. I don't know. What revivification spells do I know? Anyway, warships, yes, that's what we're here for. Let's get on to the questions this week, and they're taken from 3 videos: the War of 1812 Great Lakes War Edition, and the 2 5-minute guides HMS Agamemnon and USS Radford. So let's get on with those. James Sumpter asks, were there any British ship commanders that, in the Age of Sail, had comparatively peaceful assignments but seemed to frequently find themselves in the middle of naval incidents? Well, during the Age of Sail, you'd be hard-pressed to find a particularly long period when the Royal Navy could really say it was involved in peacetime activities. I mean, the Royal Navy's motto is Si vis pacem para bellum, which is if you wish for peace, prepare for war, for a relatively good reason. They were usually fighting someone or other, and when they didn't have a nation state to fight, they found something else to go and shoot. Usually that would either be natives in the process of colonial acquisitions, or if no one was feeling quite like acquiring new territory on that particular occasion, there were also anti-piracy operations for considerable portions of the Age of Sail, and then as those began to die off somewhat, you obviously had the anti-slavery operations as well. So, yeah, there was usually a good target for somebody to shoot at in the Royal Navy, with a few exceptions in the late 17th and early 18th centuries where there were rare and unusual periods of relative peace. Now, the one thing about that was that there was also the regular kind of convoy escort, scouting, exploration, etc., missions, and so given the truly silly numbers that the Royal Navy could balloon to in the Age of Sail during some of the more major conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars, there were quite often a lot of British captains who really liked action but found themselves without any. This tended to be the ones who are actually the most aggressive and far-sighted, because they tended to be a little bit of, shall we say, maverick officers, a bit free-thinking, and the Royal Navy during the Age of Sail had this tendency during the relatively quieter periods to start swinging back towards the very class-divided, sort of money-based ranking system that is seen in a lot of stereotypes of the British Navy. And then when war broke out, this, at varying rates depending on the conflict, gradually would give way to a more meritocratic system, usually because the really incompetent officers ended up either getting themselves beaten, captured, shot, or just generally forced out of service or pushed into a corner and told to go and patrol the Newfoundland cod banks or something similar. But once the war was over and all the maverick, highly aggressive, highly successful commanders no longer had an enemy to point their guns at, the Admiralty tended to try and sort of quietly put those officers on half pay, and as a result, those officers quite often would find themselves in the service of other navies, because that was a thing that was perfectly acceptable back then, especially a lot of the smaller breakaway navies in various small European countries that were getting independence, and South American countries as well. So these ones quite frequently would find themselves in the middle of a lot of naval incidents, because they'd effectively just go and, with the agreement of the nearby country, take over a small navy of their own and go and start shooting up other people. The fact that a lot of the people they ended up shooting up just so happened to be the people they'd been shooting at in the larger wars was, of course, a happy coincidence, which meant that the Royal Navy didn't mind all that much, because, hey, if you spent maybe 4 or 5 wars over the past century or so shooting at Spanish ships, if a bunch of your officers go off and help some various small South American countries shoot up even more Spanish ships, well, that just means there's going to be fewer Spanish ships around when round 5 comes around. Baxter Sands says, you often mention the high possibility of an Anglo-American war without various naval treaties. What do you think would be the outcome of the war, assuming that it was mainly a naval war? obviously sticking to the scope of the channel. And on a related note, when exactly did the US Navy overtake the Royal Navy? So, second question first, as is of course tradition. The US Navy took over from the Royal Navy in terms of, well, as the simple metrics of size, firepower, capability, etc. So arguably, probably some point around late 1942 or into mid 1943. The reason I say that is that, well, obviously the Washington Naval Treaty, in theory, gave parity between the US Navy and the Royal Navy for the interwar period. Now, during that interwar period, carriers existed and obviously were developing, but as I've said in other places, in my opinion, carriers as a decisive element of the fleet didn't really become a thing until pretty much the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s, which is pretty much when World War II broke out. So, although carriers are definitely a factor you have to take into account, up until that sort of start of the war, you can generally take the surface action ships as a metric of overall fleet strength. And in that regard, the Royal Navy did have a certain advantage in as much as they had a more consistent destroyer program throughout the interwar period. They also had a cruiser building program that, for the majority of the interwar period, gave them a more modern fleet, although that was changing significantly towards the end of the 1930s. And in battleship terms, although the US had the standards, and we've been over in other questions how the standards doctrine lines up, but the simple fact of the matter is that throughout the interwar period, the Royal Navy's overall firepower and speed of its battle line was basically a bit higher. I mean, the Revenge class, obviously, as they were trending down as they got worn out, but theoretically were capable of 23 knots, which put them 2 knots above the standards. And until the North Carolinas came around during the World War II period, that was about as fast as any of the US ships were going to get. And until the advent of the North Carolinas, the standard speed of 21 knots was the fastest any US battleship was going to get. Get it right, Drac. And as I say, the slowest of the British battleships were 2 knots faster than that once the disposals of the 13.5-inch gun ships had been completed. And then you had the Queen Elizabeths, which were faster, and you had the battle cruisers, which were much faster. So overall, tactically, that gave the Royal Navy battle line a strategic advantage. Plus, they had the 15-inch guns, which, once they were fixed, were obviously quite useful. The US still had a couple of 12-inch gun ships and some of their earlier 14-inch gun vessels as well. And the speed on, obviously, some of those ships was more limited. So, yeah, although it was much closer, thanks to various congressional programs and such, the Royal Navy had an edge to a degree in their surface action ships, and as I say, the carrier aircraft weren't so much of a factor at that point. Then going into World War II, it swings around quite a bit because obviously the Royal Navy's at war for about a year and a half before the US joins the war, so they take a bunch of losses. But at the same time, they're getting new ships like the King George V's coming online. The US, by the outbreak of the Second World War for them, i.e. around Pearl Harbor, they've only just about managed to get the 2 North Carolinas into service, and they have serious teething issues with their speed. The Essexes still aren't quite there yet. And then obviously at Pearl Harbor, they lose a chunk of their battle line, albeit some of it is temporary loss. And the Royal Navy has wartime experience and 2 years of wartime build, although again they've taken losses, so it's on any given month, depending on what's been torpedoed, blown up, or otherwise set on fire, the relative strength levels of the US and Royal Navies vary quite considerably. But then once you get into late 42, early 43, once the US Navy gets past that sort of rather interesting part where they were almost out of carriers in the Pacific, they start to see the fruits of their building programs hit the water. So you get the South Dakotas coming into service. In sort of towards the end of 43, you start to see the first few Essexes hit the water. A lot of the superb early wartime cruiser designs like the Cleveland start coming into service, and of course the Fletcher swarm starts to appear. So balanced against the losses of things like Lexington and the Yorktown Wasp, Hornet, etc. Yeah, it's some point in late 42, early 43 that you can qualitatively and quantitatively say that the US Navy overhauls the Royal Navy and doesn't lose that lead going forward. So, well, that's half the question. As far as the other section about Anglo-American wars without naval treaties, there are a number of flashpoints, so it depends which war we're looking at. The theoretical wars, at least. Obviously, you have the War of 1812, and then everything's kind of quiet for a bit. There's potential flashpoints in the American Civil War around the Trent incident. There's a couple of minor, not skirmishes, but sort of angry glares at each other between the end of the American Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century. There's a little bit of tension in the early 20th century, but that's massively overshadowed by the arms race with Germany and then obviously World War One. And then the last major flashpoint where war was considered to be a possibility was the beginnings of the 1920s naval arms race, which was quashed by the Washington Naval Treaty. So, I say exactly who's going to win the war depends significantly on whereabouts of those flashpoints you want to take. With obviously, as time goes on, it becomes substantially harder for the British to get a win. But in terms of in terms of a naval war, which it pretty much is going to be, because the only kind of land border that the two theoretically opposing powers share is Canada, and at the end of the day, it's always a bit of a strange one. The 1920s is much harder to predict because what ships you'd have, whether Britain would really push itself to get a full-on war fleet through its economic troubles, which it could afford on paper at least, and just how much money Congress would be willing to spend equally, and what part Japan plays in all of this is a very big question that it would probably need its own video to consider. But in some of the other potential flashpoints, the main thing to remember is that until post World War II, maybe in the mid 1930s, Congress's attitude to the US military was spend all the money during times of war, and then almost immediately stop spending practically any cent that they could get away with as soon as the war finished. So the American military, for example, in the American Civil War, balloons to this colossal size, albeit that the Navy is mostly coastal. But then you come back, so maybe, sort of Trent incident period, there's a lot of potential in the about a year or two down the line, but then you come back to the same US Navy 4 or 5 years after the American Civil War's over, and it's an entirely different picture, and they're effectively a glorified coastal defense force. But I think what it comes down to with all of these, at least in my analysis, all of these situations, is that the British are not going to invade the continental United States, except at maybe the height of empire, if they drafted like most of the Indian Army in or something. They just don't have the manpower, or, to be honest, the inclination. America is obviously a very big place, as I'm sure I'm about to find out in April. But the American Army, most of the time, is pretty small and will take a while to get its act together. So, and the American Navy likewise. So almost all of these conflicts come down to some variation of the Royal Navy will probably dominate, assuming that nobody else sticks their oar in very quickly and very decisively in the first year, 2, 3 of war, depending on what time it is, because obviously ships take a certain amount of time to build, and that gets longer as time goes on. And during that time, the American army will also need to be building up its forces to try and attack Canada. But once those 1, 2, 3, 4, however many years elapse, the American industrial and manpower advantage, which obviously gets greater as time goes on, begins to come into play more and more. So ultimately the question is, can the British force a win during that intervening period between war being declared and the Americans making victory absolutely impossible, which comes down to how did the war start? If you've got some kind of Pearl Harbor style surprise attack or some other form of dishonorable, at least in Americanized war initiation, it's probably just going to drag on and on and on. Whereas if it's a relatively unpopular war or a war that's driven by interests outside of those that the American public are generally on board with, then in theory the blockade strength and the early military victories that the Royal Navy would achieve could potentially either force the American government to the negotiating table or force the American government out of office and a new government to be installed who would go to the negotiating table. For all the various negotiations that ended the War of 1812, if you look at the American economic situation, if that war had lasted into 1815, it would have been a very different picture. But there you go. So it's a lot of hypotheticals, and to be honest, at some point, maybe next year, I'll look into some of this as a fully extended video. I mean, for the minute, this has taken over 10 minutes of the Drydock, so we should probably get on to another question. Merriman Devonshire asks a question that very definitely comes from the War of 1812 video, where they say, you mentioned the Republican Party in elections for New York at about the 1237 mark, but the Republican Party was not founded until over 40 years later. Are you referring to the Democratic Republican Party? This is a question that came up a number of times in that video's comments, and to give the short version, it's something of a complicated matter. The party that I was referring to is the now defunct political party that in most modern works is referred to as the Democratic Republican Party, and but the thing is, this is one of the hazards of using sources from the time, because the sources from the time use the name that the party was called by at the time, and at the time this party was called the Republican Party. But being dissolved in 1825, as the commentator rightly notes, doesn't actually have any direct relation to the modern Republican Party. Helpfully, given the political split in America these days, what is now referred to as the Democratic Republican Party was variously known as the Republican Party, the Jeffersonian Republicans, or the Democratic Party at various points and for various reasons. So, yeah. For clarity, the party that I was referring to was not the Republican Party of the current US political landscape. It was a different party that doesn't have any particular relation to it. But at the time, it was called the Republican Party. So, yeah, it's a case of being technically correct, which, as we all know, is the best kind of correct, but potentially confusing anybody who's following the American political landscape these days. So, apologies for that. Christopher Conrad asks, in previous episodes you've mentioned that various ships were laid down or planned on a given date, but were unfortunately practically obsolete almost from launch. Can you think of some other ships or classes that turned out to be vastly better in service than when they were originally planned? I think this falls into three broad categories. Ships that actually came out completely different to how they were planned and therefore had completely different operational parameters. Ships that they built expecting one set of performance and were just genuinely surprised they ended up with something that performed a lot better than their expectations. And lastly, probably would be the category of ships that suddenly found themselves in roles that had never been envisaged and actually turned out to be remarkably good at them. So, a good example of ships that were radically changed would be something like the HMS Royal Oak of the mid 1800s, as pictured here. Now, Royal Oak and three of its sister ships were actually built originally as some of the last wooden sail and steam powered warships in the Royal Navy. They're actually laid down, believe it or not, after HMS Warrior. So everyone was looking at them going, oh, yeah, these are not necessarily going to be as useful as we thought they were. By the time they're complete, obviously, Spirit of SMS Kaiser laughs in the background, but they didn't know about that yet because they hadn't fought the Battle of Lissa hadn't been fought at that point. So, yeah, as planned, you could say they were going to be relatively obsolete practically on launch, but as you can see here, they were stripped down, reworked, and turned into relatively functional broadside ironclads, so they turned out to be considerably more effective than had been originally anticipated. In terms of ships that just turned out to be unexpectedly much better than people thought they were going to be, the more modern example, I say, would be the Kidd class destroyers. Originally designed as upgraded spruances with very very period weaponry, shall we say, for the 1970s. With the various shenanigans going on with Iran, they ended up in the US Navy, and then ended up being overhauled and fitted with a new spec of US Navy weaponry, and then actually ended up being remarkably capable ships to the point that they're actually, as far as anyone knows, still in active service today, are having been sold off to Taiwan. And another example would actually be HMS Victory herself, built originally as an other first-rate ship of the line, and it just so happened to be that her combination of durability, armament, and particularly sailing qualities just hit that sweet spot for British first-rate ships of the line, which meant that she then formed the pattern for pretty much every British ship of the line until the Seppings Revolution really kicked the sizes up beyond what they had previously been. So yeah, that was very much an unexpected bonus. And then in terms of ships that just ended up being completely repurposed and doing exceptionally well in that role, the Lexington class has to be right up there. Make no bones about it, the Lexington class would have been awful battle cruisers, given the opposition like the Amagis and the G3s they would have ended up facing up against. They would have been a death sentence for pretty much anybody who had to fight an opposition battle cruiser whilst sailing around in them. But as aircraft carriers, they proved to be incredibly capable. I mean, obviously, due to early war relative inexperience and a few issues with the design, Lexington was lost relatively early, but Saratoga proved incredibly tough and stayed around for an awfully long time. Eventually took atomic bombs to get rid of her. And the other one I would throw in would be the Greek armoured cruiser Averof, because it was supposed to be, well, as the name suggests, an armoured cruiser, and then ended up being drafted into the role of flagship and effectively miniature battleship because apparently Greek attempts to secure themselves a battleship are cursed. So, yeah, it ended up pulling duty that various attempts at Greek battleships should have been pulling and survived them all. So, proving itself to be a significantly better investment than probably anybody imagined when it was built. Carl Dube asks, still kind of confused as how they counted guns on a ship of the line. Is it the total number of guns on the ship, so half on each side, and a couple of chase and stern cannons? or what else is it? So different navies follow different practices, but the two primary ways of working out how many cannons a ship was rated for, or how many guns, I should say, were as follows. One was how many holes have we got in the ship through which we can point a gun? Obviously, this was largely made up of the broadsides, but there would also be a few stern and bow chase guns. And this was what was known as how many guns is the ship pierced for. So effectively, how many gun ports do we have? So that would be one rating, one way of doing it, and that was quite common. There was a subsidiary to that because up on the upper decks you could quite often have guns that were just stuck up there, relatively light ones usually, that didn't have dedicated gun ports. So a subsidiary of that was how many long guns are aboard. Now that was less commonly used, more commonly used in peacetime, and definitely used in the Royal Navy. I say less so in some other navies. And this is where some of the confusion can come in, because with the two different rating systems, the two different primary rating systems that we just described, you can end up with very deceptive figures. So the Royal Navy, for example, as we covered in a question on carronades, didn't actually count carronades towards a ship's armament for a long time. So you could have a ship and they might say, yeah, it's a 32-gun frigate, and yes, it might be carrying 32 long guns. It might also be carrying a dozen carronades, but those wouldn't be counted towards it. Whereas, say, in the USA, something like the Essex or the Constitution would be rated for the number of gun ports that it had, but it might also be carrying a mixture of carronades and long guns above those in areas that didn't have their own dedicated gun ports, and so they also would be significantly overgunned compared to their rated value, but for slightly different reasons. Because, well, on the Essex, the ship almost armed almost entirely with carronades. That was very definitely rated by the number of guns it was pierced for. Otherwise, its armament would have been about 4. Don Felipe asks a fun hypothetical question. And he says, the cover artwork for Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds, which anyone growing up in the 80s and 90s will be familiar with, and oh yes, am I familiar with that. He says, what do you make of the ship featured, HMS Thunderchild, its apparent design from the picture, and its chances against a Martian fighting machine? Also, was there ever a ship of the Royal Navy given this name, and if not, why not? Well, whilst I agree that it would be awesome to have a Royal Navy ship named Thunderchild, it hadn't been done up to that point. The Royal Navy had, if you look at any of the listings for capital ship names, they weren't exactly short of an awesome name or two. And Thunderchild doesn't have a particular historical precedent, well, at least until War of the Worlds was published. And then once it had been published, I think the Royal Navy's a little bit loath to name ships after fictional entities. So, yeah, unfortunately for the immediate future, I don't think we're going to get an HMS Thunderchild, much as it would be awesome. Now, as for the artwork, it shows a form of pre-dreadnought battleship, which is something that quite a lot of interpretations of the Thunderchild seem to take after. Now, it is potentially an easy mistake to make because, well, it's a Royal Navy capital ship of the late 19th century, and everyone knows those were pre-dreadnought battleships, etc., etc. Now, yes, in the book, it's called an ironclad or a ram, but even with that, on a surface reading, it's still possible to go with this kind of vaguely pre-dreadnought layout, because after the Battle of Lissa and various other incidents, there was a bit of a fad and a craze in the late 19th century for calling pretty much every capital ship a ram or an ironclad or both. However, there are a few clues in the original War of the Worlds book that do give an idea of roughly what class Thunderchild belonged to. Specifically, when we're first introduced to it, it's introduced to us as an ironclad, but it notes that it's very low in the water, almost like a waterlogged ship, and then goes on to say it was the ram Thunderchild, having just told us it was an ironclad. And then it also says that out to sea was black smoke marking where the next ironclads of the Channel Fleet were. Then, when it goes into the attack, it ramps up its engines very quickly, and when it comes past the steamer that's the point of view for this chapter, it's described as a vast iron bulk like the blade of a plough tearing through the water. So that is not standard for Royal Navy ironclad battleships at the time. It is, however, more along the lines of a ram or torpedo ram, which they did experiment with things like HMS Polyphemus. And the other thing that a lot of people forget about this chapter is that after the Thunderchild's valiant sacrifice, the rest of the ironclads of the Channel Fleet turn up, having been, as we said earlier, further out to sea. And when they turn up, unlike Thunderchild's attack, where it rushes in close, basically trying to ram before it eventually opens fire at point-blank range, these ironclads actually move into the attack and then turn broadside and open fire on the Martian walkers. So they demonstrate a very different set of combat tactics. Now, most of exactly how that combat goes is left to our imagination because the point of view character for the chapter doesn't actually see what's going on. They hear the things, they hear the guns, they see shadows, and they see flashes, but we're never told exactly how that actually worked out. Although it is interesting to think, when you read the book, of the fact that you've just seen Thunderchild go in. Yes, it's taken down Martian war machines, but then it's been effectively erased off the planet, and then the rest of the Channel Fleet shows up, and regardless of the fate of the Thunderchild, goes straight into action anyway. But that aside, it would appear that there's enough of a distinction, both in terms of description and tactics, to say that much as the pre-Dreadnought style arrangement in that artwork is understandable, I'm pretty sure that the description of Thunderchild in the book does make a distinct case for Thunderchild being a kind of torpedo ram, which I suppose could be designed up at a later date. Who knows? Maybe I should do a reading of that particular chapter, the Thunderchild. If you'd like me to do that, let us know in the comments below, and I might do that over this upcoming holiday season. Charlie Silverwood asks, what names would you pick for the 5 new Type 31E frigates for the Royal Navy? Well, as they're likely to be the only sort of major surface warships of any description the Royal Navy is likely to get anytime soon, and the destroyers are very much locked into the letter naming system still, with well, they call them the Daring class, but let's face it, it's the D class destroyers. I actually answered this back at the end of August when somebody mentioned it on Twitter. I think when the Type 31 contract award was announced. So I said we should have Rodney, Hood, Jellicoe, Somerville, and Cunningham. Because let's face it, we need a good old Admiral class back, I think, and I think those names would work very well. Adam Ladd asks, why did the US not adopt twin turrets on their destroyers until much later than other navies? Well, it's a bit of a two-part answer, really. On the one hand, you could actually argue that they actually did adopt twin turrets or twin gun mounts, however you want, or enclosed mounts, however you want us to call it. We all know what we're talking about. You could say they actually adopted them quite early, in as much as they stuck twin 4-inch guns on a couple of Clemsons way back in towards just after the end of World War One. But in terms of the rest of their destroyers, they actually had twin mounts relatively early, as can be seen here. The Porter class of the early 1930s had twin 5-inch 38s, but the twin gun mounts tended to only be found on their larger destroyer leader types, whereas the main bulk of the interwar destroyer fleet, which was slightly smaller displacement, tended to have these single 5-inch gun mounts. Now, the impression, of course, could be given that the US Navy adopted the twin gun mount later because of this, because you had the runs of things like the Mayhans and the Fletchers with single gun mounts. But at the end of the day, actually, apart from the Italians, almost everybody else was still going with single gun mounts well up until the late 1930s. The Italians being an exception as well, obviously, as the Japanese. But pretty much everyone else was generally going for the single gun mount. Now, granted, by the end of the 1930s, the Japanese had taken the twin gun mount idea and run away with it, as have generally the Italians. The French are still largely obsessed with getting ever bigger guns on their ships. The Germans are playing around with some ideas for twin mounts and some ideas again for extremely large guns on their ships. But there is a little bit more of an uptake in the twin mount department, in as much as once you get past the tribals, pretty much all the British destroyers of the World War II period are now carrying twin mounts as well. And then you get the gearings and such right up as you get to the end of World War II in the American Navy, and of course the Sumners, I think, just before them. So yeah, in that respect, it's largely down to weight. Obviously a twin 5-inch gun mount weighs a fair bit, and with the weight restrictions on various American destroyer designs, as well as their need for a lot of fuel for range, the weight just wasn't available unless you went up to the kind of destroyer leader types until well into the war. But when you take those destroyer leader types into account, the Americans had actually adopted them fairly early. And now on to the Patreon question section. Mikko Leitinen asks, how much did the death of Admiral Yamamoto hamper Japanese war efforts? So, I mean, as I've said in a previous Drydock, Admiral Yamamoto is somewhat overrated in sort of pop culture circles. But on the other hand, he was a capable naval officer, and his death did deprive Japan of one of its more capable admirals. So, in terms of hampering the Japanese war effort, well, obviously the Japanese were never going to win the Pacific War, and although a number of Admiral Yamamoto's operations didn't go quite so much to plan, such as Midway, most of his operations did at least inflict damage and loss on the US Navy, and there were a few minor victories hidden in here and there. So afterwards, you got a series of obviously other admirals in charge, some of whom were better and some of whom were worse. If Yamamoto had not been shot down, then potentially the Japanese Navy, under his overall leadership, or if he was leading in specific situations, might have inflicted a bit more damage in certain engagements. But then again, the admirals who took part in those engagements would have been shifted to other commands, and potentially other commands might have gone worse. So yeah, overall, as I say, he was a good naval officer, and his loss allowed some less capable naval officers to be promoted up to a rank where they could, shall we say, take more losses to their own side than they inflicted on the enemy by a considerable margin. So, yeah, although him surviving isn't really going to help the Japanese stay in the war any longer than they historically did, it probably saved the Americans, I'd say, probably a good dozen large ships, of cruiser size and up, in the grand scheme of things. Kristen asks, do modern cruise missiles have the ability to punch through the latest battleship armour as found on the Iowa's Vanguard, etc.? So in this regard, it depends greatly on the kind of missile that you're talking about. That's partly due to warhead size, partly due to warhead configuration and partly due to penetration mechanism. Now I say that because, well, the smallest missiles that you could loosely define as cruise missiles, and I'm imagining you probably really mean anti-shipping missiles, the smallest missiles that meet that kind of criteria pack warheads that can be measured in the tens to low hundreds of kilos. And then for the bigger ones, anything from 200 kilos up to a metric ton. So that's going to make an awful lot of difference. Then you've also got the warhead type. So some missiles carry a more generalized high explosive warhead, or a fuel air explosive warhead, or similar sort of relatively undifferentiated explosive payloads, whereas others, particularly most of the Russian ones, as well as things like Storm Shadow, carry shaped charge warheads, which obviously massively increase their penetration compared to just, here's a lump of explosive, I'm going to set it off right next to you. And then finally is the penetration mechanism. So some anti-shipping missiles rely on effectively contact detonation. It's obviously a bit more complicated than that, but basically the warhead itself punches the hole in the ship when it explodes. Others, the warhead is armoured, so the warhead punches through and then explodes inside, and others, the entire missile enters the ship and detonates at some point, and these latter types generally tend to have the slightly less shaped warheads because, well, it's anticipated the warhead's carried itself into the ship bodily. So between those three factors, some definitely can. I mean, if you get a 500 or 1,000 kilo shaped charge warhead rocking up at Mach 3 next to battleship armor, I'm sorry, that thing is punching straight through the side of the ship. How much damage it'll do beyond that is another matter, but it will punch through the armor. Whereas if you've got, say, an undifferentiated HE warhead, or fuel air explosive warhead, or even some of the smaller anti-shipping missiles, or even some of the medium ones, to be honest, whose design is plaster yourself straight into the ship and then detonate inside, those kind of things probably either on detonation or upon impact will just smear themselves across the side of late World War II battleship's armor plating. But say it could be that, or it could be straight through and out the other side, depending on exactly what kind of missile you are using. Nickboy302 asks, was Admiral Doenitz's criticism of Admiral Raeder being an old Navy admiral justified considering the success of the U-boat arm and the failure of the Krigsmarine surface arm? Overall, on balance, I don't think it was really fair. Admiral Raeder, yes, he built a surface fleet, and yes, on reflection, trying to fight the Royal Navy with a German surface fleet, and then subsequently trying to fight the Royal Navy and the American Navy and all the various free navies with the Kriegsmarine was not a good idea, but it also wasn't Admiral Raeder's idea. You can blame Hitler for that one. Admiral Raeder built a fleet designed to fight the enemies that he was told he was going to be fighting, which primarily consisted of France. And if you look at the Kriegsmarine's match-up against France at the outbreak of World War II, and for the few years thereafter, that match-up's actually a lot more favourable. You've got the two Scharnhorsts facing off against the two Dunkirks. France has more heavy cruisers, albeit some of them are questionable value. Germany has the Hippers and the Panzerschiff. Germany gets Bismarck, or would get Bismarck around the same time as the French get Richelieu, but Bismarck has fewer teething troubles. And then the Germans are more likely to get Tirpitz into service quicker than the French are going to get Jean Bart into service. So, yeah, the Kriegsmarine is actually a relatively decent matchup for the Marine Nationale, especially when you take into account that they've got the Germans have got the Italians on their side, which makes it a bit one-sided. And the less said about what was left of the Soviet Navy, the better. So yeah, Admiral Raeder built a pretty good Kriegsmarine for the war that he thought he was going to fight and the war that he was told he was going to fight, and then Hitler managed to send him off to try and fight the Royal Navy, which was not something he'd ever really entertained, certainly not at the levels of force that he had at the time. Now, obviously, there was Plan Z, but that was at least 5 or 6 years in the offing, and as we discussed in the Plan Z video, kind of assumed that the British wouldn't actually respond in any way, shape, or form. So, yeah, I think it was a bit of an easy target for Admiral Doenitz to criticise Admiral Raeder in the manner that he did, based on what actually happened in World War Two. But as a technical criticism of the Kriegsmarine's performance in World War Two, fair. As a retrospective criticism of Admiral Raeder's attitude, no, I don't think it was fair. Iguanicus Rex asks, how much technological sharing occurred during World War II between the Bureau of Ordnance and the Army's Ordnance Department regarding armour metallurgy and projectile development? From what I can tell, surprisingly little. As you say, the scale is different, but there's an overlap in principles. But from what I can tell, the amount of cooperation was nowhere near what you'd actually expect. Partly this is because when you're talking about armour, generally speaking, for the army's purposes, i.e., for tanks, they tended to use rolled homogeneous armour, which, to an extent, in the US Navy, the closest equivalent would probably be something like Class B armour, whereas obviously the US Navy was concerned quite a lot with face-hardened Class A armour, which was not so common. And in any case, the techniques to make face-hardened armour and even homogeneous armour for naval scale thicknesses, when you're talking sort of 8, 10, 12 plus inches, are considerably different to the same processes to the processes you might go through to make tank armor that's an inch or two thick, um, maybe 3 or 4 inches thick. That to the navy, even 4 or 5 inches of armor is nothing. That's the kind of armor you'd put on a relatively lightly protected cruiser, whereas 4 to 5 inches of armor on land is wow. How are we getting through this? And similarly with projectile development, outside of a few cases where naval weapons were turned into railway guns, and obviously coastal defence and things like that, projectile development between the army and the navy was very different. Because when you're talking about artillery, which is pretty much the only place where in the sort of the 5, 6, and 7 to 8 inch range there was a bit of overlap in field artillery size and navy artillery size, there wasn't a lot of commonality with shell types. I mean, high explosive shell is a high explosive shell. That doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out. But when it came to, well, armor piercing shells, obviously at that caliber, the US Navy had a great interest in armor piercing, whereas until they needed to punch holes in bunkers, the artillery portion of the US Army wasn't particularly interested in armor piercing shells because they lacked the explosive payload compared to HE, and, well, if you send a shell burrowing 40 foot underground to disturb some of the elder deep moles, then that's not really doing a lot for the enemy that you're trying to actually shoot on the surface. When it comes to the kind of guns that are exercising armor-piercing potential on the army side, more commonly you talk about tank guns, so at the beginning of the war, sort of 37mm and upwards, and then as you get, well, no, 37mm is German caliber, but you know what I mean, sort of the low tens of millimeters. And then when you get into the latter part of the war, you've got 75, 76, 90, 105 mil. You're beginning to approach the smaller naval calibers, but you're talking about 3 to 4 inch weapons. And in the Navy, a 3 to 4 inch weapon won't have an AP round normally. It's too pathetic. So as I say, the scale is different, and also the usages are different. I mean, there could be a certain sharing of scientific theory behind armor penetration, but even then, although the broad principles are the same, the actual mechanics of armor penetration, when you're talking about sort of a ton plus heavy naval battleship shell coming down and hitting face hardened steel, as compared to high velocity 76mm penetrator round hitting a tank, the details of those mechanics are actually quite a bit different. And so, yeah, as I say, from what I can tell, there was a little bit of exchange, but there was a reason why the two ordnance departments were separate in the first place. Quite apart from the fact that they're not just about armor and projectiles, and a lot of that came from private industry. They're also about procurement and things like that, which obviously they're not really going to cross over on. And finally, Matthew Taylor asks, what were some feasible naval wars that could have, but did not, happen between World War One and World War Two, and would any of them not have been hopelessly one-sided? Okay, so feasible naval wars that could have happened but didn't, or maybe I'll slightly modify that, could have escalated but didn't, because otherwise we're going to run a bit short of examples. Um, to be honest, most of the flashpoints that happened in the interwar period did tend to develop into some kind of conflict. But in terms of things that could have escalated to a naval war, there were various clashes between the nascent Soviet Union and the Japanese over in the Far East, which could have led to Russia-Japanese War II Electric Boogaloo. And it's probably just as well for the Russians it didn't, because if you thought the Second Pacific Squadron was bad, the interwar Japanese fleet versus the interwar Russian fleet would have been, how to put this politely, a one-sided slaughter on the scale of which Admiral Rozhesvensky's squadron being annihilated at Tsushima would probably be seen as the gentler version. So yeah, that would have been horribly one-sided. There was, of course, the Spanish Civil War. Now, that didn't involve too much of a naval conflict, partly because, well, Spain's already small navy was split into two, so the statistical chances of what was left of the fleet running into each other was relatively low. But in theory, you could have had two España class fighting each other, which would have been interesting. There was a lot of colonial back and forth, but obviously that the people that the Europeans tend to colonize don't tend to be heavily noted for their massive modern navies. There was, of course, the various conflicts surrounding the ongoing Russian Revolution - formation of the Soviet Union. Some of that was covered in the video I did on the Baltic War in collaboration with Great War Channel. So that, in theory, could have escalated. Although, again, that would have been a bit one-sided considering Britain was involved and later on so was France. And, yeah, what was left of the Russian Baltic fleet versus what the Royal Navy and the French could bring to bear, pretty one-sided there. In theory, the League of Nations could have tried to do something about the Italians invading various parts of North Africa. But again, if that had been any kind of united intervention front, pretty much anybody except who would have got involved, except for France, had a navy that would have rolled straight over the Italians. They didn't have the Littorias at that point. They just had a small collection of warmed over World War One designs. And even though that's what most people were limited to, most anyone else who would have got severely involved had considerably more warmed over World War World War One designs, and in the case of Britain and America, considerably more capable as well. There were, of course, as there inevitably would be, a series of small border disputes in South America, a couple of which could have kicked off into larger conflicts if they were spurred onto. The only one that really did was the Chaco War, and with the greatest of respect to Bolivia and Paraguay, neither of them really had much of a navy. But in theory, some of the other conflicts, as I say, could have gone up. But in the interwar period, outside of the Chileans getting the Admiral La Torre back, nobody else's battleships were in particularly good operational condition. So although on paper, sort of either some combination of Brazil, Chile, and Argentina fighting each other would have been interesting to see. Outside of Chile, I don't think a tremendous amount would have been accomplished by either of the others two. I mean, the Minas Gerais and the Rivadavias were still vaguely operational, but not anywhere close to fully. So yes, if you're looking for potentially interesting naval conflicts in the interwar period, in terms of something that's not going to be a completely lopsided matchup, you are probably looking at either the Spanish Civil War somehow getting the two factions' navies to fight each other, or something major blowing up between the two of the three dominant countries in South America. And that carries us over the 1 hour marks, and that therefore brings this episode of the Drydock to an end. Thank you very much for listening. Hope to see you again in another video, and as I say at the beginning, there is that itinerary for my trip to America. So thank you to those of you who've already written in, and now that I've got everything locked in, I will be writing to everybody who has already sent me an email about my trip to the States over the next few days. And for those of you who haven't yet, now's your chance. I shall potentially put some kind of Google Drive link or something, maybe some kind of spreadsheet up so you can have a handy reference chart if you're interested. Thank you, and bye-bye for now.